In February 1914, a former president of the United States stepped into a dugout canoe and vanished into the Amazon rainforest. No map. No signal. No one knew where that river even led. His name was Theodore Roosevelt, the man who once led America, who survived a bullet to the chest, but was nearly swallowed alive by a nameless river deep in the Brazilian jungle.
I'm Leonard, 65 years old. I've crossed the Sahara, slept in the jungles of Borneo, and nearly died on the Andes. But every time I revisit this story, my palms still sweat. Because this isn't a movie, this is real. Starvation, malaria, betrayal from within, and a father who nearly took his own life so his son could survive. Now, before I begin, drop a comment and tell me, where are you listening from right now? New York, Texas, somewhere in California? Or maybe it's the middle of the night wherever you are. And if you love real exploration stories like this one, hit subscribe, because this journey ahead is long, and it gets very, very dark.
The cold November rain hammered against the cobblestone streets of Manhattan, pooling in the gutters along Fifth Avenue where horse-drawn carriages splashed through the gray afternoon. The year was 1912, and inside a sprawling mansion at Sagamore Hill, the fireplace crackled, but it did nothing to warm the man sitting alone in his study.
Theodore Roosevelt stared at the newspaper headlines spread across his desk, the ink still fresh, the words cutting deeper than any bullet ever had. He had lost. Not just an election, he had lost everything he'd built.
Now, if you don't know who Theodore Roosevelt was, let me paint you a picture. This was not some ordinary politician. Standing about 5'8", barrel-chested like a prize fighter, with a thick walrus mustache that twitched when he was angry, and round spectacles that made his intense blue eyes look even sharper, Roosevelt was the kind of man who filled every room he walked into.
At 54 years old, he carried himself like a man half his age, though his body had already taken more punishment than most soldiers see in a lifetime. He'd been a sickly, asthmatic child in New York City, so frail his father built him a home gym and told him to rebuild himself from nothing. And he did. He transformed into a boxer, a rancher, a soldier, a hunter, and eventually the youngest president in American history at 42.
But here's the thing about Roosevelt. He wasn't just tough on the outside. The man had an iron will forged by tragedy. Back in 1884, on Valentine's Day of all days, his first wife Alice and his mother Mitty died in the same house, just hours apart. Alice from kidney failure after giving birth to their daughter, his mother from typhoid fever. Roosevelt wrote a single large X in his diary that night, and beneath it, "The light has gone out of my life." He didn't cry in public. He didn't talk about it. He packed a bag and disappeared into the Badlands of Dakota Territory, where he spent 2 years ranching cattle, hunting grizzlies, and sleeping under the stars until the grief loosened its grip. That was who Roosevelt was. When life broke him, he didn't sit down. He moved. But 1912 was different. This defeat wasn't just personal. It was public, humiliating, and entirely of his own making. See, Roosevelt had already served 2 terms as president, from 1901 to 1909. He'd chosen not to run for a 3rd term, handing the presidency to his close friend and protege, William Howard Taft, a massive gentleman, over 300 pounds, with a warm laugh and a love for the law. Taft wasn't a fighter like Roosevelt. He was a judge at heart, careful, measured, the kind of man who'd rather settle a dispute with a legal brief than a fist. Roosevelt picked him because he trusted him to continue his progressive reforms. But Taft drifted. He aligned with conservative Republicans, rolled back some of Roosevelt's policies, and the friendship between the two men crumbled like dry earth. Roosevelt felt betrayed. So he did what Roosevelt always did. He charged. He challenged Taft for the Republican nomination in 1912. When the party chose Taft anyway, Roosevelt stormed out and created his own party, the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. The name came from Roosevelt himself. When a reporter asked him if he was fit enough to run, He pounded his chest and declared he felt as strong as a bull moose. And just to prove the universe had a sense of drama, during a campaign stop in Milwaukee, a man named John Schrank walked up and shot Roosevelt in the chest. The bullet pierced his steel eyeglass case and passed through the folded 50-page speech in his coat pocket before lodging in his rib. Roosevelt coughed into his hand, saw no blood, and concluded the bullet hadn't punctured his lung. So he walked onto that stage, blood seeping through his shirt, held up the torn manuscript for the crowd to see, and delivered his speech for over an hour before agreeing to go to a hospital. That was the man. Unstoppable. Unbreakable. Until November 5th, 1912. The three-way race between Roosevelt, Taft, and the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson, a tall, thin, bespectacled academic, the former president of Princeton University, reserved and intellectual, the opposite of Roosevelt in almost every way, ended in disaster. Wilson won in a landslide. Roosevelt came in second. Taft, his former friend, finished a humiliating third. The Republican vote had been split in half, and Roosevelt knew it was his fault. He hadn't just lost the presidency, he'd handed it to Wilson, destroyed his friendship with Taft, and torn the Republican Party apart. The months that followed were the darkest of Roosevelt's life. He retreated to Sagamore Hill, his estate on Long Island, where the hallways echoed with the laughter of his 6 children, now mostly grown and gone. His second wife, Edith, a composed, sharp-eyed woman with auburn hair turning silver, whose quiet strength had anchored the Roosevelt household through decades of chaos, watched her husband sink into a restless melancholy she'd never seen before. Roosevelt paced. He wrote letters no one asked for. He picked fights in newspaper columns. But none of it filled the void. He was 54, politically finished, and for the first time in his life, he had no war to fight. Then came the invitation. The American Museum of Natural History in New York, an institution Roosevelt had loved since childhood, where he'd donated specimens as a boy and dreamed of becoming a naturalist, invited him to join a lecture tour through South America, with a side expedition to collect animal specimens in Brazil. It was supposed to be a comfortable trip. Riverboats down well-mapped waterways, speeches in Buenos Aires, a gentleman's adventure. Roosevelt said yes immediately, anything to escape the walls closing in. But the trip changed the moment he arrived in Brazil, and met a man who would alter the course of everything. Colonel Cândido Mariano da Silva Rondon, a lean, weathered Brazilian military officer in his late 40s, of indigenous Bororo and Terena descent, with dark, sun-beaten skin, a rigid posture, and eyes that had seen things the jungle keeps secret. Rondon had spent over 2 decades carving telegraph lines through the Amazon, contacting uncontacted tribes with a philosophy that stunned even his critics. Die if you must, he told his men. Kill never. He was Brazil's greatest explorer, a man who had buried friends in unmarked graves along jungle rivers and kept walking. Rondon told Roosevelt about a river, an unmapped tributary deep in the Amazon basin. The locals called it Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt. No one had ever traveled its full length. No one knew where it emptied, how long it ran, or what dangers lurked along its banks. It could lead to the Amazon. It could lead to a dead end. It could lead to death. For most men, that description would be a warning. For Theodore Roosevelt, it was an invitation. He scrapped the safe itinerary. Every comfortable plan, every mapped route, every predictable stop, gone. In its place, a journey into the complete unknown. A river no one had conquered. A jungle that swallowed men whole. Roosevelt looked at that darkness and walked straight toward it, because that was the only direction he knew, and he had no idea what that river was about to take from him. If you're hooked on this story of a president who traded the White House for the most dangerous jungle on Earth, hit that subscribe button and stick around, because this is just the beginning, and it gets much, much worse. The highland plateau of Mato Grosso stretched out like the surface of another planet. Dry, wind-beaten, and covered in sparse scrubland that crackled underfoot, it sat nearly 2,000 feet above sea level in the interior of Brazil, a vast emptiness where the sky pressed down so close you could almost touch it.
The air was thick with dust and the hum of insects, and by late 1913, as the wet season crept closer, the heat had turned punishing, the kind that sat on your chest and made every breath feel like work. This was where the expedition gathered, and already, before a single paddle touched water, things were falling apart.
Roosevelt arrived in South America looking nothing like the man who had once bounded up the steps of the White House 2 at a time. At 55, he had put on considerable weight, his barrel chest now buried under a layer of softness that his khaki shirt couldn't hide. His left leg, badly injured years earlier when a streetcar struck his carriage in 1902, still gave him trouble, and his blind left eye, the result of a boxing match during his presidency that he'd kept secret from the public, meant his depth perception was unreliable. He moved with determination, sure, but anyone watching closely could see the slight hitch in his step, the way he gripped a walking stick just a beat too long. He was not the man he used to be, and the jungle had a way of finding every weakness you brought into it. His son Kermit was a different kind of worry. 24 years old, tall and lean with his mother's sharp cheekbones and his father's restless energy, Kermit had graduated from Harvard and spent the past year working for a railroad bridge-building company in Brazil, which was how he'd picked up Portuguese. He was brave, no question. Perhaps too brave. Kermit had a reckless streak that those close to him recognized as something darker, a young man who didn't always seem to care whether he lived or died. Part of it was temperament, but part of it was Belle Willard, his fiancée, the daughter of the American ambassador to Spain, a graceful and spirited young woman waiting for him in Madrid. The distance gnawed at Kermit. He wrote to her constantly, letters filled with longing that betrayed how unmoored he felt. Roosevelt had brought Kermit along, partly because he wanted his son to share in the adventure, but mostly because he feared what Kermit might do to himself if left alone with that restlessness and no purpose. It was a father's calculation. Keep the boy close, keep him busy, keep him alive. The irony of dragging him into one of the most dangerous places on Earth to accomplish that would become painfully clear soon enough. The rest of the expedition's core team assembled in pieces. Colonel Rondon, already introduced to Roosevelt weeks earlier, was there with his characteristic rigidity, issuing orders in clipped sentences, his dark, weathered face betraying no emotion. He brought with him a handful of Brazilian soldiers and a group of roughly 16 camaradas, local men hired as paddlers, porters, and laborers. These were tough, wiry men, many of mixed indigenous and Portuguese descent, who knew the rivers and the forest in the way only people born to it can. They were strong, but they were not explorers. They were workers, and the distinction would matter. Then there was George Cherry, the expedition's naturalist, a quiet, sun-browned American in his early 50s, with a neatly trimmed mustache and calm gray eyes that had seen decades of South American wilderness. Cherry had collected specimens across Venezuela, Colombia, and the Amazon basin for years. He was the kind of man who could skin a bird in under a minute while calmly discussing the weather, and he carried a revolver on his hip not for show, but because he'd needed it before. He was steady, dependable, and he would become one of Roosevelt's closest companions in the months ahead. His counterpart, Leo Miller, another naturalist, was younger and less seasoned, but enthusiastic, assigned to a separate branch of the expedition early on and spared the worst of what was coming. The expedition's doctor was José Antonio Cajazeira, a Brazilian military surgeon, compact and serious, with small round glasses and the careful hands of a man trained to work under pressure. He carried a limited medical kit, quinine for malaria, basic surgical tools, bandages, and though he was skilled, the supplies he'd been given were nowhere near adequate for what lay ahead. And then there was the man responsible for all of it going wrong before it even started. Anthony Fiala, a stocky, enthusiastic former Arctic explorer in his 40s, with a round face and a confident manner, had been hired to handle the expedition's logistics. On paper, Fiala looked perfect. He'd led a polar expedition to Franz Josef Land years earlier. He knew about provisioning, about harsh conditions, about survival. But the Arctic and the Amazon were two entirely different beasts, and Fiala planned for one while walking into the other. The canoes he selected were heavy wooden dugouts, built for calm water, not the violent rapids of an unmapped jungle river. He packed food in quantities that made sense for the first few weeks, but fell catastrophically short for a journey that could stretch months. Rope, essential for lowering boats through rapids, building portage lines, and 100 other survival tasks, was woefully insufficient. Equipment was either redundant or wrong. Fiala meant well. He worked hard. But his mistakes would cost the expedition dearly, and some of those costs would be measured in lives. The overland march from the plateau toward the river's headwaters was supposed to be the easy part. It was anything but. The expedition brought a train of pack mules and oxen to haul supplies across the highland before reaching the water. But the animals, bred for temperate climates, crumbled under the tropical conditions. Ticks, fat, blood-gorged carapatos, buried themselves in the animals' hides by the hundreds, draining them until they staggered and collapsed. Mules sank into boggy ground up to their bellies and had to be dragged out or abandoned. Oxen simply lay down and refused to move, their eyes glassy with exhaustion. One by one, the pack animals died, from parasites, from heat, from the sheer hostility of the landscape. And with each carcass left rotting on the trail, supplies had to be abandoned too. Crates of food, spare equipment, things they would later wish they had. The men fared only slightly better. The camaradas marched under loads that bent their backs, swatting at clouds of biting flies, their bare feet or thin sandals offering little protection against thorns and rocks. Cherry recorded in his journal the steady deterioration of morale, noting how the cheerful singing that marked the first days of the march gradually faded into silence. Rondon pushed forward with mechanical discipline, stopping only to take measurements and chart coordinates, his devotion to scientific precision clashing with the growing urgency to simply survive the approach. Roosevelt himself marched without complaint, but those around him could see the toll. He sweated heavily, his breathing labored in the heat, and the old leg injury flared with each uneven step. Kermit, meanwhile, ranged ahead with a young man's impatience, taking risks on river crossings and scrambling over terrain that made the older men wince. Father and son rarely spoke about the danger directly. Roosevelt expressed his concern in sideways glances, in quiet words to Cherry, after Kermit disappeared around a bend. By the time the expedition reached the banks of the River of Doubt in late February 1914, they were already diminished. Fewer animals, less food, exhausted men, broken equipment, and ahead of them, stretching into the green darkness of the Amazon, was a river no one had ever followed to its end. A ribbon of brown water that gave away nothing about what it held. They hadn't even started, and they were already losing.
On February 27th, 1914, the expedition lowered their dugout canoes into the dark, tea-colored water of the River of Doubt, and the jungle closed behind them like a door slamming shut. The river was narrow here at its headwaters, no wider than a country road, hemmed in on both sides by a wall of green so dense it seemed to breathe. The canopy overhead knitted together into a ceiling that blocked out the sky, and beneath it the air hung thick and wet, heavy with the smell of rotting vegetation and damp earth.
Sunlight came through only in thin, broken shafts, dappling the water's surface like scattered coins before the current swallowed them. There were 7 canoes in total, carved from heavy tropical hardwood, sitting low in the water under the weight of men and what remained of their supplies after the disastrous overland march. Roosevelt sat in one of the larger canoes, his bulk filling the stern, his round spectacles fogged with humidity, a pith helmet shading his face.
Kermit was in a separate canoe ahead, already pulling away with the impatient energy his father both admired and feared. Rondon rode in the lead, upright and rigid as a flagpole, scanning the water with the focus of a man who understood that this river owed them nothing. Nobody spoke much that first morning. The paddle strokes were steady, almost rhythmic, and for a brief stretch the river behaved itself. Smooth current, gentle bends, the canoes gliding forward as if the whole thing might actually be manageable. But that peace was a lie, and the river told them so within hours.
The first rapids appeared around a bend without warning, the water suddenly narrowing and dropping over a shelf of rocks with a roar that echoed off the canyon walls. White foam churned between black boulders, and the lead canoe barely pulled to shore in time. Roosevelt stared at the rapids from the bank, his jaw set. This was the first of what would become an endless, soul-crushing pattern. Every set of rapids forced the same terrible decision. Option 1, run the rapids, steering the heavy canoes through the chaos and praying they didn't flip or shatter against rock. Option 2, rope the canoes down along the edge, men standing waist-deep in the current, hauling on lines while the water tried to rip the boats from their hands. Option 3, portage, which meant unloading every canoe, carrying hundreds of pounds of supplies, and then the canoes themselves through trackless jungle to a point below the rapids, hacking a path with machetes through undergrowth, so thick a man couldn't see 3 feet ahead. Each portage could take days for a distance you could throw a stone across, and every day spent portaging was a day burning through food they couldn't replace. The rapids came relentlessly. Some stretches offered barely a mile of calm water before the next cascade announced itself with that low, rising thunder. The camaradas, those 16 Brazilian laborers who did the back-breaking work of paddling, hauling, and carrying, bore the worst of it. They waded into the current to guide canoes through channels, their bare feet slipping on algae-covered rocks, piranhas circling in the eddies below. Piranha attacks were constant. The fish, drawn by any disturbance in the water, would strike at exposed skin with razor teeth, leaving clean, deep cuts that bled freely and attracted more of them. Below the surface lurked freshwater stingrays, flat, sand-colored creatures nearly invisible on the riverbed, whose barbed tails could drive a venomous spine through a man's foot and leave him screaming for hours. The camaradas learned to shuffle their feet rather than step, but even then, someone got stung nearly every week. Above the waterline, the jungle waged its own war. Mosquitoes descended in clouds at dusk and dawn, their high-pitched whine becoming the soundtrack of every miserable evening. These weren't just nuisances. They carried malaria, and the expedition had limited quinine. Swarms of tiny black flies called borachudos burrowed into any exposed skin, leaving welts that itched so badly men scratched themselves raw. Fire ants carpeted the forest floor and swarmed up legs without warning, their bites like hot needles. Wasps built nests in the trees overhead, and more than once a machete strike during portage sent an angry swarm down on the men. Botflies laid eggs on mosquitoes, which then deposited larvae into human skin. The larvae burrowed in and grew beneath the flesh, a horror that had to be smothered and squeezed out. At night, vampire bats circled the camp, landing silently on sleeping men and lapping blood from small incisions made with their teeth, so painless the victim rarely woke. And then there were the creatures no one saw but everyone feared. Jaguars, the Amazon's apex predator, powerful enough to crush a caiman's skull in its jaws, left tracks along the riverbank that made the camaradas whisper prayers. Anacondas, thick as tree trunks, lay coiled in the shallows. Caimans watched from the banks with yellow eyes, motionless as logs until something came too close. The Chintalarga people, an indigenous tribe whose territory the river cut through, remained invisible but ever present. Rondon recognized the signs immediately, freshly cut saplings forming bridges over tributaries, arrows embedded in tree trunks as warnings, the faint sound of wooden drums carrying across the water at night. The expedition was being watched, tracked, and evaluated by people who knew this forest intimately, and who had every reason to view these strangers as a threat. Rondon, true to his lifelong principle, ordered that no weapons be drawn, no aggressive posture taken, and that gifts, knives, beads, cloth, be left at conspicuous points along the bank. Whether the Chintalarga accepted them or not, no one ever knew. But the arrows in the trees were message enough. You are not welcome here. The canoes began to break. Heavy dugouts that looked indestructible on calm water proved brittle against rapids. A canoe would slam sideways into a boulder and crack along its hull, or get pinned broadside by the current and split in half. Each lost canoe was a catastrophe. It meant supplies gone, food, equipment, rope, and it meant the expedition had to stop, find a suitable tree, fell it, hollow it out, and shape a new canoe. This process, even with experienced hands, took days. Days during which the remaining food supply dwindled, and men sat in the rain with nothing to do but listen to the jungle and wonder if they'd ever get out. The tension between Roosevelt and Rondon, simmering since the overland march, sharpened on the river. Rondon insisted on stopping at every tributary to take measurements, record coordinates, and officially name each waterway for the Brazilian government. It was his duty, his mission, the entire reason Brazil had sanctioned this expedition. Roosevelt understood it intellectually, but every hour spent surveying was an hour not moving downstream, an hour closer to starvation. He pressed Rondon to move faster. Rondon, with the quiet stubbornness of a man who had spent his life in the jungle and answered to his own country's flag, refused to be rushed. The two leaders respected each other, but they were pulling in opposite directions, Rondon toward science, Roosevelt toward survival. And the river was patient enough to punish them both. By the end of the first 2 weeks, the expedition had covered a fraction of the distance they'd hoped. They were already behind on rations. Several canoes had been lost and rebuilt. Men were bleeding, bitten, and feverish. And the river, stretching ahead into the green unknown, showed no sign of mercy. They were inside the beast now, and it was beginning to digest them.
The first death came without warning, the way death always does in places like this. Simplicio, one of the camaradas, a quiet, wiry man with calloused hands and the kind of lean endurance that comes from a lifetime of physical labor along Brazilian rivers, was working the ropes at a set of rapids that had pinned the expedition for nearly 2 days. The water there funneled between two massive boulders into a chute of white chaos, the roar so loud the men had to shout directly into each other's ears.
The plan was to lower the canoes on ropes, guiding them through the narrow channel, while men on both banks held the lines taut. It was dangerous work, the kind that required perfect coordination and a healthy respect for what moving water could do to a human body. Simplicio was waist-deep in the current, his feet braced against the rocky bottom, hauling on a rope attached to one of the loaded dugouts. Then the rope snapped, or his footing gave.
No one could say exactly what happened because it was over in a heartbeat. The current seized him, dragged him under, and he was gone. Just like that. One moment a man, the next moment nothing but churning brown water. The expedition searched downstream, scanning the banks, probing the eddies. They found the canoe, battered and half-submerged, a quarter-mile below. They never found Simplicio. The river had taken him completely, as if he had never existed at all.
The camp that night was silent in a way it hadn't been before. The camaradas sat in small clusters, their faces drawn, speaking in low murmurs. Cherry noted in his journal that the mood had shifted fundamentally. Before Simplicio, the danger had been abstract, something that might happen, something to be careful about. Now it was real. The river could kill them. Not might. Could. And would, if given the chance. Roosevelt sat apart, writing in his own journal by the dim light of a sputtering candle, his pen scratching steadily. Whatever he felt, he kept behind that famous iron composure, but the lines around his eyes had deepened, and Cherry noticed he stared at Kermit's canoe longer than usual the next morning before the expedition pushed off. Kermit. That boy was going to give his father a heart attack before the jungle got the chance. A few days after Simplicio's death, the expedition reached another set of rapids. This one a long, violent cascade where the river dropped over a series of ledges and the water boiled white for hundreds of yards. Rondon ordered a portage. It would take days, but it was the safe choice. Kermit, however, looked at the rapids and saw something else. A line. A possible channel between the rocks where a canoe, handled well, could slip through. He'd done it before on smaller rapids, trusting his reflexes and the skill of his bowman, and each time he'd made it. It fed something in him, that rush, that proof he was alive when the water tried to say otherwise. Roosevelt told him not to. Rondon told him not to. Kermit went anyway. He launched his canoe into the current with his bowman, a camarada whose name the records remember only dimly. A young man, strong, good with a paddle, who trusted Kermit's judgment because Kermit was the colonel's son and moved with a confidence that looked like competence. The canoe shot forward, caught the main current, and for a few seconds it looked like Kermit had been right. The bow cut through the first wave cleanly. Then the river showed its hand. A submerged rock caught the hull and spun the canoe sideways. The current slammed it broadside into a boulder with a crack that carried over the roar of the water. The canoe folded. Kermit was thrown into the rapids, tumbling through white water, his body smashing against rocks as the current dragged him under and spat him back up. He grabbed at anything, rock, root, air, and by some miracle his hand found a branch overhanging the water. He held on, the river pulling at his legs like a living thing trying to finish the job, until men on the bank reached him with ropes and hauled him out, gasping, bleeding from cuts across his arms and face. His bowman was not so lucky. The young camarada went into the same water and never came up. They found his body later, downstream, broken against the rocks, his skull fractured. 2 men dead now. The river's toll was climbing. Roosevelt watched the entire thing from the bank. Cherry, standing beside him, later wrote that he had never seen such an expression on Roosevelt's face. Not anger, not fear, but something worse. A kind of helpless recognition. His son had nearly died 10 yards in front of him, and there was nothing he could have done. Nothing. For a man who had spent his entire life charging toward danger, who believed down to his marrow that courage and will could overcome anything, that helplessness was a poison more dangerous than any the jungle carried. And then the jungle came for Roosevelt himself. It happened during another portage, an unremarkable one in a stretch of river choked with rocks. Roosevelt was helping push a canoe through a shallow channel, wading in knee-deep water, when his right leg struck a submerged rock edge. The gash was deep, cutting into the shin of the same leg that had been badly injured in the 1902 carriage accident, the one that had already required surgery and left the bone weakened. In a clean hospital, the wound would have needed stitches and antibiotics and a week of rest. Here, in water contaminated with every organism the tropics could breed, it was a death sentence waiting to be signed. Within days, the wound turned angry, red, swollen, hot to the touch. Infection set in, spreading up the leg. Then the malaria returned. Roosevelt had first contracted malaria years earlier, and the parasite had never fully left his blood. Now, with his body weakened by the infected leg, inadequate food, and weeks of brutal exertion, the disease roared back. His temperature spiked above 104 degrees Fahrenheit. He lay in the bottom of the canoe, drenched in sweat, shivering violently despite the equatorial heat, his eyes glassy and unfocused. In his delirium, he began reciting poetry, the same passage over and over, lines from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Kubla Khan, the words tumbling out in a feverish loop that unsettled everyone who heard them. Cherry sat beside him, mopping his forehead with a damp cloth, and wondered privately whether Roosevelt would survive the night. Dr. Cajazera worked with what he had, which was almost nothing. His quinine supply was dangerously low. His surgical instruments were basic. He lanced the infected wound, drained what he could, applied what dressings remained, and watched. There was nothing more medicine could offer in the middle of the Amazon. The rest was up to Roosevelt's body, and Roosevelt's body was failing. Food was now a crisis. The expedition's carefully rationed supplies had dwindled to almost nothing, and the jungle, for all its overwhelming greenery, was cruelly stingy with anything edible. This was one of the great paradoxes of the Amazon rainforest. It looked like the most abundant place on Earth, but nearly all its biological wealth existed in the canopy, 100 feet overhead, utterly out of reach. The forest floor was dark, sparse, and barren. Cherry hunted when he could, bringing back monkeys, parrots, and the occasional palm heart. The men chewed on nuts that tasted like soap and ate whatever moved slowly enough to catch. Dysentery spread through the camp, weakening men who were already skeletal. Malaria jumped from person to person through the ever-present mosquitoes. The camaradas, once strong and singing, now moved like ghosts, their ribs visible through their shirts, their eyes hollow. The expedition was dying, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, man by man, pound by pound, hope by hope. And the river stretched on ahead, endless and indifferent, offering no indication of how much further they had to go, or whether there was anything at the end of it, but more of the same green darkness. Morale didn't just drop. It collapsed.
The murder, when it came, didn't arrive with drama or warning. It came the way most terrible things did on this river, suddenly, stupidly, born from hunger and the slow rotting of men's minds under pressure no human being was designed to endure. The killer's name was Julio de Lima, and if you'd looked at him at the start of the expedition, you wouldn't have marked him for what he'd become.
Julio was one of the camaradas, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s with heavy-lidded eyes and a sullen mouth that rarely smiled. He wasn't the strongest in the group, and he wasn't the weakest, but he had a quality the others noticed early, a laziness that bordered on defiance, a way of doing just enough to avoid punishment and not a stroke more. While other camaradas hauled canoes through mud and hacked portage trails until their machetes dulled,
Julio lingered at the edges, resting when backs were turned, disappearing during the worst of the labor and reappearing when the work was done. The other men resented him. In a group where every ounce of effort mattered, where one man's weakness could mean another man's death, Julio's shirking was more than annoying. It was dangerous. But laziness wasn't what made Julio a threat. Hunger did that. As rations shrank to almost nothing, a few spoonfuls of beans, a handful of hardtack per man per day, the temptation to steal became overwhelming. And Julio gave in. He was caught multiple times taking food from the communal supplies, slipping extra portions when he thought no one was watching. In a city, this would be petty theft. Here, on a river where every calorie stood between a man and starvation, it was an act that could condemn his companions to death. The other camaradas were furious, but it was one man in particular who confronted Julio directly.
His name was Paixón, a tall, muscular camarada, older than Julio, with a broad face weathered by years on the river and arms knotted with the kind of muscle that only comes from decades of hauling and paddling. Paixón was well liked in the group, a steady worker with a quiet authority that the younger men respected. He was also a man with his own troubled past. He had once killed a man in a dispute years before the expedition, a fact that was known but not dwelt upon, because out here, a man's usefulness mattered more than his history. Paixón took it upon himself to keep Julio in line, confronting him about the stolen food with the blunt authority of a man who didn't have patience for excuses. He dressed Julio down in front of the others, shaming him publicly, telling him that if he stole again, there would be consequences. It was the right thing to do. It was also the last thing he ever did. On March 15th, the expedition had stopped to portage around yet another set of rapids. The men were scattered through the jungle, hauling loads, when Julio found Paixón alone on the trail. What passed between them in those final seconds, no one knows. Perhaps Julio said something. Perhaps he said nothing at all. What the expedition heard was a single gunshot cracking through the forest, sending birds screaming from the canopy. They found Paixón on the ground, shot through the body at close range, a look of surprise still frozen on his face. He was dead before anyone reached him. Julio stood nearby for a moment, long enough for witnesses to see the rifle in his hands. And then he turned and ran into the jungle, crashing through the undergrowth until the green swallowed him whole. The camp erupted into chaos. The camaradas were terrified and enraged in equal measure. Some wanted to pursue Julio immediately, track him down, and deliver the justice the jungle wouldn't. Rondon, standing rigid at the scene, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his face trembled, insisted that Julio must be found and brought back to face a proper trial. This was Rondon's way. He was a man of law, of civilization carried into the wilderness, and the idea of letting a murderer simply vanish offended everything he believed in. He ordered search parties formed. But Roosevelt, still fevered and barely able to sit upright, understood what a manhunt would cost. Every hour spent searching for Julio was an hour not moving downriver. Every calorie burned chasing a killer through impenetrable jungle was a calorie taken from men who were already starving. And Julio had a rifle. Pursuing him into dense forest where he could ambush them from behind any tree was a risk that could add more bodies to the river's toll. The argument between Rondon's principles and the expedition's survival played out in tense, hushed conversations at the water's edge. In the end, reality won. They left Julio behind. The expedition broke camp and continued downriver, leaving a murderer alone in the Amazon with a stolen rifle and whatever food he'd hidden on his person. It was, as everyone understood without saying it aloud, a death sentence. The jungle would do what justice could not. A man alone in that forest, without a canoe, without companions, surrounded by indigenous tribes who had no reason to show mercy to a stranger. Julio's chances were essentially zero. Whether he died of starvation, snakebite, disease, or an arrow through the chest, the result would be the same, and the expedition would never know for certain which fate found him first. The murder changed something in the group that went beyond the loss of Paixón. It shattered the last fragile thread of trust between the men. The camaradas eyed each other differently now. If one of them could snap, who else might? Cherry began sleeping with his revolver within reach. Rondon posted guards at night, not against jaguars or indigenous attacks, but against their own men. The expedition had survived the river's rapids, its piranhas, its fevers and starvation. Now it had to survive itself. And then came the night that nearly ended everything. Roosevelt's condition, already dire, deteriorated sharply in the days following Julio's crime. The infection in his leg had spread, the flesh around the wound swollen tight and streaked with red lines running upward, a sign of blood poisoning that Dr. Cajazera recognized with barely concealed alarm. The malaria burned on unchecked, his fever spiking and falling in cycles that left him drenched and shaking. He had lost enormous amounts of weight, his famous barrel chest now sunken, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to shrink daily. He could barely walk. He could barely sit. The man who had once charged up San Juan Hill was now carried to and from the canoe, like an invalid. One night, deep in the fever's grip, Roosevelt called Kermit and Cherry to his hammock. The rain was falling in sheets, drumming on the canvas tarp overhead, and the river hissed in the darkness beyond the firelight. Roosevelt's face was pale and waxy, his eyes burning with a clarity that cut through the delirium. He spoke quietly, the way a man speaks when he has made a decision and is no longer arguing with himself about it. He told them he was holding the expedition back, that his condition was worsening, not improving, that every day they slowed down to accommodate him was a day closer to the entire group dying on this river. He told them to leave him behind, to take the remaining supplies and the strongest men and push downriver as fast as they could. He would stay, he would manage. What he didn't say directly, but what Kermit and Cherry both understood, was the small vial of morphine sulfate that Roosevelt carried in his kit. He had brought it from the beginning of the journey, enough carefully measured to end things quietly if the moment came. And Roosevelt believed the moment had come. He was not speaking from self-pity. He was making a tactical calculation, the same kind he'd made as a military commander. One life traded for many. The math was simple. Kermit looked at his father in the rain-streaked darkness, and he refused. Not politely, not diplomatically, but with a ferocity that startled even Cherry. He told Roosevelt that if he stayed, Kermit would stay with him, that he would not leave this jungle without his father, alive or dead, that if Roosevelt chose to die here, he was choosing to kill his son too, because Kermit would not go on alone. It was the only argument that could have worked. Roosevelt could sacrifice himself. He could not sacrifice Kermit. The morphine stayed in the kit. Roosevelt closed his eyes, the rain falling around him, and said nothing more. In the morning, the expedition continued downriver. That night was the lowest point, the absolute bottom of the entire journey. and they were still deep inside the jungle, with no idea how far they had left to go.
The signs appeared so quietly that at first no one trusted them. A tree stump on the left bank, its trunk cut clean at an angle that only a steel axe could produce. Not a machete hack, not a storm break, a deliberate human cut, the kind made by someone who had a tool forged in a factory and a reason to clear land. Sherry spotted it first from the bow of his canoe and stared at it for a long moment without speaking, as if saying the word aloud might make it vanish.
Then another stump appeared, and another, and then a faint trail worn into the mud of the riverbank, leading up into the forest toward something unseen. After nearly 2 months on the River of Doubt, after the deaths, the starvation, the murder, the fevers, the night Roosevelt nearly ended his own life, these crude marks in the mud were the most beautiful things any of them had ever seen. They meant people, not the invisible indigenous tribes who had watched them from the shadows. People with axes. People connected, however loosely, to the outside world. The river had begun to change days earlier, though the men were too exhausted and sick to fully register it. The canyon walls that had squeezed the water into violent rapids gradually fell away, the banks widening, the current slowing from a murderous churn to something almost navigable. The rapids still came, but less frequently now, and the stretches of calm water between them grew longer. The canopy overhead thinned in places, letting actual sunlight reach the water for the first time in weeks. Warm, golden light that hit the men's gaunt faces and made them blink like creatures emerging from underground. The river was broadening, deepening, behaving less like a trapped animal and more like a proper tributary finding its way toward something larger. Roosevelt, still bedridden in the bottom of his canoe, his infected leg propped on a rolled blanket, his skin the color of old parchment from weeks of malaria, felt the change in the water's rhythm, even through his fever. The rocking gentled. The roar of rapids faded to a murmur. He opened his eyes and saw sky instead of canopy, and for the first time in weeks, something shifted behind those round spectacles that might have been hope. Then they found the seringueiros, the rubber tappers of the Amazon, scattered communities of Brazilian men and their families who lived along the tributaries, harvesting latex from wild rubber trees in a trade that was brutal and isolating but connected them, thinly, to the economy of the outside world. The first seringueiro they encountered was a lean, sun-darkened man in a torn cotton shirt, standing on the bank beside a crude wooden shack with a smoking rack for curing rubber hanging behind it. He stared at the canoes drifting toward him as if watching ghosts materialize from the river, and in a sense, he was. No one came down this waterway. No one. The fact that these skeletal, fever-ravaged strangers had traveled the full length of what the locals called the River of Doubt was, to him, barely believable. But the seringueiros were generous in the way that isolated people often are when strangers arrive at their door. They offered food, farinha, the coarse manioc flour that was a staple of the Amazon, along with dried fish, beans, and fresh fruit. For men who had been eating monkeys and palm hearts and gnawing on half-rotten nuts for weeks, it was a feast beyond description. Cherry wrote that some of the camaradas wept as they ate, their hands shaking, shoveling food into their mouths with the desperate urgency of men who had genuinely believed they would starve to death. Dr. Cajazera was finally able to supplement his depleted medical supplies with basic remedies the rubber tappers kept on hand, crude but effective treatments for fever and infection that the jungle communities had developed over generations. Roosevelt received quinine, proper wound care for the first time in weeks, and something almost as important, rest on solid ground, in a hammock that didn't rock with the current, surrounded by the sounds of human habitation instead of the river's endless, indifferent roar. The seringueiros also gave them something no amount of food or medicine could match: information. They confirmed what Rondon had long hypothesized, but couldn't prove. The River of Doubt flowed into the Aripuana, which in turn emptied into the Madeira, one of the Amazon's great tributaries. The river was real. It went somewhere. It was not a dead end spiraling into swamp. Not a cruel joke of geography that would have meant all this suffering was for nothing. The River of Doubt was a genuine major tributary of the Amazon basin, stretching roughly 950 miles from its headwaters on the Mato Grosso Plateau to its confluence with the Aripuanã. The expedition had done what it set out to do. They had mapped a river that no outsider had ever traveled. Rondon, still upright, still rigid, still taking measurements even now, recorded the final coordinates with the same meticulous precision he'd maintained from the first day. For him, this was vindication. The scientific data, the named tributaries, the mapped course. These were Brazil's now, added to the nation's geographic record, proof of what lay inside its own uncharted interior. The Brazilian government would later rename the river Rio Roosevelt, a tribute to the former president who had risked everything to follow it to its end. But the cost. The cost was written on every man who climbed out of those canoes. Roosevelt had lost over 55 pounds. The barrel-chested bull moose of American politics now looked like an old man, hollow-cheeked, his skin yellowed from recurring malaria, his famous vigor replaced by a fragile slowness that shocked everyone who saw him. The leg wound, though no longer immediately life-threatening, had left damage that would never fully heal. His heart, strained by weeks of fever and deprivation, had weakened in ways that would compound over the coming years. When Roosevelt finally returned to New York, stepping off the ship onto the docks, friends who had known him for decades didn't recognize the gaunt, shuffling figure in the oversized suit. He smiled for the cameras, because Roosevelt always smiled for the cameras, but the smile didn't reach his eyes the way it used to. The jungle had taken something from behind them, something that wasn't coming back. He lived 5 more years. 5 years of recurring malarial fevers that would strike without warning, leaving him bedridden for days. 5 years of a heart that grew steadily weaker, of inflammatory conditions that doctors connected directly to the damage sustained on the river. He remained active, writing, speaking, advocating, but the machine was breaking down. On January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep at Sagamore Hill. He was 60 years old. When Vice President Thomas Marshall received the news, he reportedly said the death came quietly, peacefully, as if the great restless engine had simply run out of fuel. Those closest to Roosevelt believed the River of Doubt had killed him. Not on the water, but slowly, over years, the Amazon's poison working through his blood and bones long after he'd left its shores. The bullet in Milwaukee couldn't do it. Political defeat couldn't do it. But a nameless river in the Brazilian jungle took from Theodore Roosevelt the one thing he valued above all else: his vitality. Rondon returned to his life's work, spending decades more advocating for indigenous rights and mapping Brazil's interior, eventually becoming a national hero honored with the rank of Marshal. Kermit survived the river but carried its darkness home. He drank heavily, battled depression that worsened with the years, and struggled to find steady ground. During World War II, he enlisted and was stationed in Alaska, far from the tropics, but not far enough from his own demons. In 1943, at Fort Richardson, Kermit Roosevelt took his own life. He was 53. Those who knew him traced the fracture back to the Amazon, to the rapids, to the night his father almost died, to the weight of having saved a man he loved from a river that never stopped trying to claim them both. The River of Doubt, once unnamed, unmapped, unknown, became Rio Roosevelt, a permanent mark on the geography of South America. It stands as a monument to both human courage and human arrogance, a reminder that the wildest places on earth do not care who you are, what you've conquered, or what title you once held. The river took its toll, and the river moved on, as rivers always do.
Now, before I let you go, I want to leave you with something. This story happened over 100 years ago, deep in a jungle most of us will never see. But the truth buried inside it, that is something we carry with us every single day.
Theodore Roosevelt was the most powerful man in America. He had money, fame, strength, and a name that opened every door. But when the jungle closed in around him, None of that mattered. Not the title, not the reputation, not the years of victories. The river did not care who he was. It treated him the same way it treated every other man on those canoes. And in his darkest moment, lying in that hammock in the rain, ready to give up, the thing that saved him was not power or wealth or willpower. It was love. His son looked him in the eye and said, "I am not leaving without you." And that was enough to keep him alive. Think about that for a second. Think about your own life. Maybe you are not on a river in the Amazon. Maybe your jungle looks like a job you hate, a relationship that is falling apart, a debt you cannot climb out of, a diagnosis that scared you, or just a season of life where everything feels heavy and dark and you cannot see the way forward. We all have our river of doubt. We all hit that moment where the fever is high and the food is gone, and the voice inside says, "Just stop. Just give up. It would be easier." But here is what Roosevelt learned the hard way. You do not survive alone. You survive because someone refuses to let you quit. And sometimes you are that someone for another person, and you do not even know it. The people around you, your family, your friends, even a stranger who says the right word at the right time, they are your Kermit. And one day, you might need to be Kermit for somebody else. You might need to look at someone you love and say, "I am not going anywhere without you." The other lesson is simpler, but just as important. The river does not last forever. Roosevelt spent nearly 2 months in that green hell, convinced every day that the jungle would never end. But it did end. The water widened, the rapids slowed. The rubber tappers appeared on the bank with food and directions. The suffering had a finish line, even though he could not see it while he was in the middle of it. Your hard season has a finish line too. You just cannot see it yet. Keep paddling. Roosevelt came out of that jungle a broken man, but he came out. And the river that almost killed him now carries his name forever. Sometimes the thing that nearly destroys you becomes the thing that defines you. Not because of how much it hurt, but because you refused to let it be the end of your story.
So if this journey meant something to you tonight, do me a favor. Share this with someone who might need to hear it, someone going through their own river right now. Drop a comment and tell me what part of this story hit you the hardest. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, stories about real people who faced impossible odds and found a way through. And one last thing. I am 65 years old. I have seen a lot of this world. Mountains, deserts, oceans, jungles. And if there is one thing all those miles have taught me, it is that none of us make it through alone. So wherever you are tonight, whatever river you are on, I am asking God to bless you, to give you strength when yours runs out, to put a Kermit in your life when you need one, and to remind you, gently, that the water will widen and the rapids will slow, and you will find your way to the other side. Comment Amen if you believe that. I will see you in the next story. Stay safe out there.